The night was finally here, the much-anticipated talent show at the community hall. The stage was set, the lights were dimmed just enough to create a buzz of excitement in the air, and the chatter of the crowd built as more people found their seats. The wooden floors creaked under the footsteps of those preparing the final touches behind the curtains. This wasn't just any event, it was the talk of the town, where everyone hoped to catch a glimpse of something special. The evening promised everything from dance routines and magic tricks to stand-up comedy and live music. People had been buzzing about it for weeks, sharing stories of who was expected to perform, what talent would surprise everyone, and which contestants would bring their A-game. The tension was thick with anticipation. It was one of those rare events that drew everyone together, young and old, familiar faces and strangers. Backstage, a figure stood quietly in the shadows. She wasn't looking for attention. In fact, she almost seemed to be avoiding it. She wasn't part of the hype, not someone who was known in the town for making a name for herself. But tonight was different. Tonight she was about to do something that would take a lot more courage than anyone in the audience could imagine. The performers lined up nervously backstage, some pacing back and forth, others chatting with friends for comfort. But the one person who caught everyone's eye was the woman who barely seemed to fit in with the rest. She stood apart from the group, her eyes fixed on the floor, arms folded tightly across her chest. Dressed in simple clothes, she didn't stand out in the way the others did. No flashy clothes, no expensive-looking accessories, just someone who looked like she'd come out of her everyday life. Heading to an event like this without much of a second thought. The other performers exchanged glances and whispers, unsure of what to make of her. Some were still trying to figure out if she was even part of the show. "Do you think she's a last-minute replacement?" one of them murmured. "Is she even going to perform?" said another, not quite believing someone so ordinary-looking would be brave enough to step out on that stage. But despite their whispers, the woman stood there quietly, not showing the slightest sign of uncertainty. She had a quiet resolve about her that made the others curious, yet no one dared to ask her about her act. It wasn't like she was new to this. In fact, she'd been thinking about it for a long time. She knew how the crowd would react. She knew they wouldn't take her seriously at first, and she expected that. In a way, it had always been like that for her, never in the spotlight, never expecting much of the world, but always quietly pushing forward. As the sound of applause from the previous act echoed through the walls, she stepped forward into the limelight and the nerves kicked in. The backstage area was suddenly full of loud noises as people prepared for their turns. The air seemed to grow heavier, but she didn't let it overwhelm her. She simply stood waiting for the right moment. The moment came sooner than expected. The stage manager poked his head through the curtains. "Next up," he called out, not looking at the woman at first. He was busy checking his list, making sure everything was in order. But when he glanced at her, the look of surprise crossed his face and he paused. It wasn't just the fact that she didn't look like the others. It was the sheer quietness around her that made him unsure of how to proceed. She wasn't fidgeting. She wasn't shifting her weight back and forth as if nervous. She wasn't even smiling. She just stood there. "Are you up next?" he asked, raising an eyebrow. She nodded, her eyes still focused on the stage in front of her, as if it was already her time to perform. "Right, well, go on then," he said, waving her forward, still not quite sure what to make of her. And with that, she stepped out from behind the curtain and onto the stage. The spotlight hit her immediately, casting her in a sudden, almost blinding glow. The audience could see her clearly now, and they quickly began to look her up and down. She wasn't tall, not particularly fashionable, nor did she have any striking features that might make her stand out. Her hair was simple, styled loosely. She wore a plain black dress that hung just above her knees, a modest outfit compared to the flashy attire others had worn. No one could figure out what to expect from her. The crowd muttered among themselves, unsure of whether this was a prank or a last-minute fill-in for someone who didn't show up. A few scattered chuckles rose from the crowd. They weren't mean-spirited, but more like nervous laughter, the kind that bubbles up when people are unsure of what's going on. "Is she even going to sing?" someone whispered. "Does she even know how to sing?" But instead of being discouraged, the woman stood still, not flinching from their murmurs. She didn't glance at the crowd or give a nervous wave. She simply took a slow breath, her hands resting at her sides, and waited. The longer she stood there, the more the crowd's laughter seemed to die down, turning into an uncomfortable silence. The stage felt enormous, the weight of their eyes on her too heavy. After what felt like an eternity, she moved toward the grand piano positioned at the center of the stage. The music had already started from the back, the sound of a soft melody filling the hall. She reached the piano, and that's when the audience began to quiet down, their laughter fading as they tried to make sense of what was happening. She sat on the bench, her hands gently touching the cool keys, her back straight but relaxed. There was a brief moment of hesitation, a flicker of doubt in her mind. But the feeling quickly passed. This was it. She had practiced for years, always in the shadows, playing where no one could hear her. It had always been something personal, something just for her. But tonight was different. She was here, and she was ready. She took a deep breath, the silence growing even thicker. With a soft, almost delicate motion, her fingers moved across the keys, producing the first note. The crowd leaned in, confused. It was such a simple sound, almost fragile. But it was enough to grab their attention. A quiet murmur went through the audience. No one had expected that. She wasn't playing some simple tune like they'd assumed. She wasn't about to mess up. She was in control, every note deliberate and calm. The woman closed her eyes, letting the music fill her as she played. Her fingers moved faster, more confidently now, as the melody began to grow richer, more complex. The crowd, initially unsure, was beginning to realize they had misjudged her. The laughter had stopped, replaced by a stunned silence. People in the audience shifted in their seats, unsure of how to react. A few exchanged confused glances, but no one dared to interrupt. The music flowed from the piano, clear and powerful, and the woman seemed to disappear into it as though the stage and the crowd didn't even exist. It was just her and the piano, connected in a way that made everything around them fade away. The woman wasn't just playing notes on a piano, she was pouring her soul into the music, telling a story that no one had expected to hear. Slowly, the audience began to listen in earnest. Whatever they had thought before, whatever judgments they had passed, seemed irrelevant now. They were caught in the moment, lost in the music. The simple act of walking onto the stage had been the first step. But now she wasn't just a face in the crowd anymore. She was something else entirely, something that commanded attention in the most subtle and powerful way. And just like that, the atmosphere had changed. As the music swelled in the dimly lit room, the audience found themselves drawn into something they hadn't expected. The sound of the piano, which had started off so delicately, was now enveloping the entire hall. Each note seemed to weave through the air, stirring emotions they hadn't anticipated. The audience had come to the talent show looking for entertainment, something to distract them from their busy lives. They hadn't come looking for something that would move them, something that would change how they saw the night unfolding. But that was exactly what was happening. The woman at the piano, who just moments before had been the subject of whispers and quiet laughs, was no longer just a figure on the stage. She was the center of attention now, not because of any flashy gestures or a big personality, but because of the music she was creating. There was a quiet power in her playing, something that made the room hold its breath. The usual distractions, the coughs, the shuffling of feet, the tapping of fingers on phones seemed to vanish. In their place was a kind of stillness, the kind you only get when everyone's attention is fully locked onto one thing, one person. At first, the audience wasn't sure what to make of it. The music was unfamiliar, but it was beautiful. It didn't follow the patterns of what they expected from a talent show performance. There was no obvious rhythm to clap along to, no catchy tune to hum afterward. It wasn't something that could be easily reduced to a quick and simple judgment. Instead, it was a slow unfolding journey that seemed to have a life of its own. The melody started soft, almost tentative, but gradually became more sure, more confident. With each note, the audience's initial skepticism faded. The laughter from earlier was now a distant memory. Now the room was filled with the sound of fingers gliding over the keys, drawing something almost magical from the piano. The way she played was nothing like what anyone had anticipated. She wasn't looking down at her hands, trying to remember the next note, or nervously adjusting her position on the bench. No, she was lost in it. Her whole body swayed slightly as her fingers danced across the keyboard, effortlessly guiding the music as though she had been playing for years. The calm expression on her face showed no signs of fear or uncertainty. It was as if this moment was simply meant to be. The more the music flowed, the more the audience began to understand. They could feel the energy building in the room, rising from the very heart of the music. At first, the sounds were soft, almost like a whisper, but as the piece progressed, they began to swell into something larger, more powerful. The notes weren't just notes anymore. They were emotions, memories, stories being told without a single word being spoken. There was a depth to the music that the crowd hadn't expected. It wasn't just a performance. It was an experience. The woman at the piano wasn't trying to impress anyone, wasn't seeking approval or validation. She was simply expressing something inside herself, something pure and real, and in doing so, she had managed to bring the audience along with her, making them part of the story she was telling. As the piece continued, the mood of the music shifted. It was as though the piano was echoing a conversation between two worlds, one of sorrow and one of hope. There were moments of tension, where the melody would rise and fall unexpectedly, leaving the audience on edge. Then just as suddenly there were moments of calm, sweet, quiet passages that seemed to offer a breath of relief. The audience, caught between the peaks and valleys of the music, couldn't help but feel drawn deeper into her performance. The sound wasn't just filling the hall, it was filling their hearts too. The raw emotion that poured from the piano was impossible to ignore. It didn't matter that they had never seen her before, didn't know her name or what had brought her to this stage. All that mattered was that in this moment, she had their full attention. It was hard to believe that just a few minutes ago some had found her out of place, an unlikely participant in the show. But now it was clear that she belonged here more than anyone else. There was no pretension in her playing, no attempt to be something she wasn't. She wasn't trying to dazzle them with flashy tricks or bold gestures. She was just being herself, open, honest, and vulnerable. As she continued, the music seemed to take on a life of its own. The energy in the room was shifting. People leaned in, trying to catch every note, every pause. The silence that had once felt awkward now seemed almost sacred. It was the kind of silence that happens when everyone is completely absorbed, when nothing else in the world matters except for what's unfolding before them. It was only when the music slowed again, dipping into a quiet moment, that some of the audience started to shift in their seats. A few glanced at each other, eyes wide as if they were unsure whether what they were experiencing was real. Others simply stared, transfixed by the sound of the piano, unsure of what to say or do. There was a sense of reverence in the air, as though they were all part of something bigger than just a performance. But what was even more remarkable was how the woman at the piano seemed to be entirely at ease. She was no longer the nervous, uncertain person who had walked onto the stage. Now she was the one in control, guiding the music with a sure hand. She wasn't worried about how she appeared or what anyone thought of her. She was simply lost in the music, and in doing so, she was bringing everyone else along for the ride. The crowd was starting to realize something important. They had misjudged her, assumed that she was just another person trying to fit into the show. They had laughed at her earlier, not understanding what she was capable of. But now, as the music swelled once more, it was clear they had been wrong. They had underestimated her, but that was part of the magic of the moment. In just a few short minutes, she had completely changed the narrative. She wasn't just some random person who had decided to get up and play for a few minutes. She was an artist, someone who had honed her craft, someone who had something to say, even if she wasn't speaking with words. For the first time in the night, the audience was beginning to feel something real, something that went beyond simple entertainment. There was a depth to her music, something that made them look at her differently. What had started as uncertainty and laughter had transformed into awe and admiration. The atmosphere in the hall had completely shifted. The noise that had once filled the room, the casual conversations, the whispers, the occasional chuckles, was gone. In its place was pure attention, complete focus. Even the smallest movements, the way she shifted her fingers, the way she breathed with each note, were now something to be noticed. She had taken control of the moment, and there was no turning back. Her music filled every corner of the hall, pulling at the hearts of the audience. It was as if, for the first time that evening, they were truly listening, not just hearing but feeling the music. The doubts they had about her were all gone now. She wasn't just performing for them, she was speaking to them, and in the most unexpected way she had connected with each and every person in the room. It was a kind of magic, the way the music wrapped around them, drawing them in, one note at a time. They didn't know how long she had been playing, but it felt like time had stopped. The rhythm of the world outside had disappeared, and all that was left was the woman at the piano and the music she was making. And as she continued to play, one thing became clear to everyone in the room. They would never forget this moment. The music flowed through the room like a gentle breeze, each note carrying with it a sense of warmth and depth. The audience, once uncertain and skeptical, now found themselves fully immersed in the moment. It was as if the world outside the hall no longer existed. The busy streets, the ticking of the clock, the worries of the day, none of it mattered anymore. There was only the music and the woman at the piano, who was now completely lost in her performance. Her fingers moved effortlessly across the keys, gliding over them with an ease that suggested years of practice and dedication. The melody had become richer, more intricate. The soft notes that had filled the room earlier had transformed into something more powerful, something that seemed to resonate with the very soul of everyone in the audience. Each chord she played was like a word in a story, each pause a moment of reflection, each rise and fall of the music a shift in the emotional landscape. The room was silent, save for the sound of the piano. No one moved, no one dared to make a sound. It was as if the music had wrapped itself around the crowd, holding them in its grip. Even those who had been skeptical at first, those who had chuckled or whispered doubts, were now completely captivated. There was no laughter now, only a collective stillness, a shared experience that seemed to bind them all together. For the first time that evening, the audience wasn't just watching a performance. They were experiencing something real, something that went beyond entertainment. They were being drawn into a world of emotion and beauty, a world that the woman at the piano had created with every note she played. The music was no longer just sound, it had become a language of its own, a language that spoke directly to the heart. As she played, the music began to shift. The soft, flowing melody that had filled the room began to build in intensity, becoming darker, more complex. It was as though the woman was taking them on a journey through a landscape of emotions. There were moments of tension, where the music seemed to be holding its breath, building towards something. Then, just as suddenly, it would release, easing into a more peaceful, reflective passage. It was a dance between light and shadow, between joy and sorrow, each note painting a picture in the minds of the listeners. The woman's face remained calm and focused, her eyes closed as if she were lost in her own world. She wasn't looking for applause, wasn't worried about how she was being perceived. She was simply playing, allowing the music to carry her wherever it wanted to go. And in doing so, she had taken the audience with her. They were no longer passive observers. They were part of the journey. They could feel the highs and lows of the music in their own hearts, as though the piano was speaking directly to them. The longer she played, the more the room seemed to change. The air felt different, thicker somehow, as though time itself had slowed down. It wasn't just the music that was making an impact, it was the presence of the woman at the piano. There was a stillness about her, a quiet confidence that spoke volumes. She wasn't performing for the audience. She wasn't trying to impress them or make them clap. She was simply sharing something deeply personal, something that only the music could express. The intensity of the music continued to grow, rising and falling in waves. The piano was no longer just an instrument. It was a vessel, carrying the emotions of the woman who played it and the audience who listened. Each note seemed to pulse with life, as though the piano itself was alive, breathing along with the performer. There were moments of sheer power, where the music seemed to shake the very walls of the hall, followed by quiet, tender moments that made the audience lean in closer, eager not to miss a single note. As the music reached its peak, the room seemed to hold its breath. The woman's fingers danced across the keys with such speed and precision that it was almost as if she were channeling something beyond herself, something far greater than any single person could control. The sound filled the room, rich and full, sweeping over everyone in its path. It was as if the very air around them had transformed into music, and then just as suddenly the music began to slow. The intensity that had built so gradually now seemed to melt away, leaving behind a sense of calm and resolution. The notes became gentler, more reflective, as though the journey had come to its end. The last few chords were played with such care, each one lingering in the air before fading away, leaving behind a quiet stillness that seemed to fill the room. The woman's hands rested on the keys for a moment, her fingers gently pressing down as if savoring the final echoes of the music. Then, with a deep breath, she slowly lifted her hands and allowed them to fall to her sides. She remained seated at the piano, her eyes still closed, as though she were taking a moment to collect herself, to let the music settle within her. And for a long moment, there was nothing but silence. The crowd, still in a daze from what they had just experienced, sat frozen in their seats. No one moved. No one spoke. It was as though time had stopped, and the music that had filled the hall had taken its place in their hearts. No one knew how to respond, how to break the stillness that hung in the air. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the first clap came. It was tentative at first, almost unsure, but then, as if some invisible signal had been sent, the applause grew louder, spreading like wildfire through the audience. It was a slow build, each clap adding to the momentum, until the entire room was filled with the sound of appreciation. The woman, still sitting at the piano, didn't open her eyes. She didn't move. She simply sat there, letting the applause wash over her, knowing that this moment was enough. She didn't need any further validation. She had shared her music, and that was all that mattered. The audience, now fully aware of what they had just witnessed, couldn't help but stand. The standing ovation came not just because of the woman's skill, but because of the way she had transformed the room, the way she had made them feel something deep and real. The music had touched something inside each person, something that they hadn't expected to feel when they first walked into the hall. It wasn't just about the performance, it was about the connection, the raw emotion that had been shared. As the applause continued, the woman remained still, her head slightly bowed, her hands resting quietly in her lap. She didn't need to bask in the applause. She didn't need to say anything. The music had spoken for her, and the audience had heard it loud and clear. When the applause finally subsided, the room fell into a comfortable silence once more. The audience slowly began to filter out of the hall, still buzzing from the experience they had just shared. Some whispered to one another, still trying to process what had just happened. Others stood in quiet contemplation, unwilling to let go of the moment. But no one would forget what they had witnessed that night. The woman at the piano, who had been overlooked and underestimated just moments before, had left an indelible mark on the audience. They had come to the talent show expecting to be entertained, expecting a few laughs or some lighthearted fun. What they had received instead was something far more profound, a reminder of the power of music, of art, of the ability to reach deep into the heart and stir something that words alone could never express. As the final few people exited the hall, the woman stood up from the piano, her back straight, and made her way off the stage. She didn't look back, but she didn't need to. The mark she had left would last long after the applause had faded. The days that followed were filled with a strange quiet. The woman, whose performance had so completely changed the atmosphere of the talent show, was now a figure of intrigue. People who had been in the audience couldn't stop talking about her. They had all come to the event expecting the usual type of entertainment, fun performances, a few laughs, maybe a surprising talent or two. What they hadn't expected was a performance that left them with so much more than just applause. After the show, whispers started circulating. Some people still couldn't believe what they had witnessed. Others found themselves replaying the music over and over in their minds, trying to understand why it had resonated with them so deeply. It wasn't just the technical skill, though that was impressive enough. It was the emotion, the sincerity, the way she had poured herself into the music. She hadn't been trying to prove anything to anyone. She had simply played what was in her heart, and in doing so, she had connected with the audience in a way that few could. Even those who hadn't initially understood her had been moved. A few days after the event, some of the people who had been laughing at her in the beginning admitted to feeling something unexpected. They had walked into the hall ready to judge, ready to be entertained. But they had left feeling as though they had witnessed something much bigger than just a show. It wasn't just the sound of the piano, though it was powerful. It wasn't just the way she played with such ease and grace, though that had certainly left an impression. It was something deeper. It was the way she had made the audience feel. In a world where everything often felt rushed, surface level, and impersonal, her performance had reminded them of something simple yet profound: the power of real connection. She had left the stage without a word, without so much as a smile in their direction. and yet somehow it felt like she had said everything she needed to say. There was no need for an encore, no need for further recognition. The music had done all the talking for her. She had given the audience something they could hold on to, something they could remember long after the show was over. Back in her own life, things were quiet. She didn't want the attention. She wasn't seeking fame or approval. For her, the music had always been about something deeper. It had been a way to express herself when words failed, a way to communicate feelings that couldn't easily be explained. Playing the piano wasn't about proving anything. It was about being honest with herself, being honest with the world around her. The reactions she received after the show were, in many ways, a surprise. She hadn't expected such an impact. When she had walked onto that stage, she had simply wanted to play. But now it seemed that her music had affected more people than she could have imagined. There were messages, some direct, some passed along by friends, all expressing the same sentiment. The performance had changed something in them. Some had been reminded of their own dreams, the ones they had forgotten or pushed aside. Others had found comfort in the music, something that had given them a sense of peace during difficult times. There were even a few who had come up to her afterward, shy and unsure of what to say. They told her they had been skeptical at first, but they had been blown away by what they had seen. Their words were always kind, filled with appreciation for her performance. She was taken aback by the kindness of their words, but couldn't help but wonder why they felt the need to explain themselves. She hadn't been looking for approval after all. Still, it was hard to ignore the shift that had occurred. The show had turned out to be a turning point for many people. Those who had once laughed at her had now been brought to a place of introspection. The power of music had done what nothing else could. It had transformed the way they saw things. It had reminded them that there was more to life than just the daily grind, more to being human than just working, entertaining, and passing the time. Despite the praise, the woman remained humble. She hadn't done anything special, she thought. She had simply played the music she felt, the way she always had. But that was the beauty of it. It wasn't the technicalities of the music, the perfect execution, or the grand gestures. It was the rawness of it, the honesty, the simple truth behind the notes. A week after the performance, a few people who had been in the audience decided to get together. They couldn't stop talking about it, and eventually, they made the decision to try and find her. They wanted to thank her. They wanted her to know how much her performance had meant to them. When they finally tracked her down, it wasn't with the intention of offering her praise or putting her on some sort of pedestal. Instead, they simply wanted to acknowledge the impact she had made. They told her how they had been skeptical at first, unsure about what to expect, but now they were grateful. Grateful for the way she had reminded them that art wasn't just for entertainment, it was for healing, for connecting, for remembering what really mattered. The woman listened quietly as they spoke, unsure of how to respond. She had never been someone who sought recognition. She had always believed that art should speak for itself, that the value of a performance should be found in its ability to move people, not in the accolades or applause that followed. And yet, as they spoke, she realized something important. It wasn't about her. It wasn't about the performance itself. It was about the way that music had brought people together, had given them a moment to reflect on their lives. What they were really thanking her for wasn't her playing. It was the experience she had created, the way she had made them feel. They left soon after, thanking her one more time for what she had done. The woman sat in silence for a moment, reflecting on what had just happened. She wasn't sure how to process it all, but there was something comforting in knowing that for at least a few people, the music had made a difference. She didn't need to be famous. She didn't need the world to know her name. All she had ever wanted was to share her music, to let it speak for her. And in that moment she realized that she had done just that. As the days passed, life returned to its usual rhythm. The audience went on with their lives, but something had shifted within them. They would go about their routines, but they would carry the memory of that night with them. The woman, too, would continue playing, but it was no longer just a personal escape. It had become a way to connect, to share something with others, even if they never fully understood the depth of it. The quiet transformation that had taken place after the show was subtle, but it was there. The woman had done something that no one else could have. She had used the power of music to touch lives in a way that words could not. And in doing so, she had reminded everyone who had been there that the world, at its core, was about connection, about sharing experiences, about being moved by something greater than ourselves. And though she would never seek recognition, she would always remember the way that her music had affected others. The applause, the praise, the kind words, it didn't matter to her. What mattered was that in that one moment she had made a difference. Weeks went by and life slowly returned to its regular rhythm. The woman who had taken the stage so unexpectedly had faded into the background, as if she had never stepped in front of that crowd. The world around her went on with its usual pace. People hurried through their daily routines, kids went to school, workers sat at their desks, and everyone carried on as if nothing had changed. But something had changed, at least for the people who had been there that night. The woman didn't seek out any more attention. She didn't want it. What she had shared through her music was enough. It had been a moment of pure connection, a fleeting but deep bond between her and the audience. That was more than enough. She had touched their hearts without ever saying a word, and for her, that was the greatest accomplishment. But sometimes, as she walked through the streets of her town, she would catch whispers, little conversations about the performance. People in cafes or shops would mention the woman at the piano, talking about how they had never heard anything like it before. Some would even say how that performance had inspired them to start something they had been putting off for years. Learning an instrument, picking up a forgotten hobby, or simply remembering the joy of creating something from within. The woman knew this was happening, but she never acknowledged it. She would simply smile to herself and keep walking, content in the knowledge that the music had done what it was meant to do. It had opened hearts, awakened emotions, and left a lasting impact that words couldn't fully describe. She didn't need to explain any of it. The music had already spoken. Her life was quiet. It was simple, but it was fulfilling. She spent her days playing the piano when she felt the urge, creating melodies that were hers alone. She didn't share them with anyone, not because she didn't want to, but because music for her was like a journal. It was her way of processing the world around her, a language she could use to express feelings that didn't always have words. But even in this quiet life, there were times when she couldn't escape the memory of that night. She would wake up in the morning and the first thing that came to her mind was the sound of the piano, those powerful emotional chords that had filled the hall. She would sit at her own piano just to hear those notes again, to remind herself of the connection she had felt with the audience, the way their hearts had opened to her music. Over time, the story of that night began to take on a life of its own. People who had been there spoke of it to their friends, to their families. It became something of a legend, a story told over and over again about the woman who had silenced a room with her music, who had started out as the joke of the show but had ended up leaving everyone in awe. It wasn't just a story about the performance. It was a story about what art could do when it was shared honestly, without expectation or pretense. And so, slowly but surely, word spread. Not in the way most stories spread, through social media or through articles in the paper, but in a quieter, more personal way. It spread in conversations between friends and neighbors, in letters passed between strangers. It was a story about connection, about the ability to create something real and meaningful in a world that often felt disconnected. The woman didn't know about this growing legend. She didn't need to. It wasn't important to her. But there was something beautiful in knowing that what she had done had resonated with so many people. And though she never set out to leave an impression, she had done so in a way that was simple and genuine. She had just played from the heart, and in doing so had created something much more significant than she could have ever imagined. One day, not long after the performance, a young man came to her door. He was nervous, his hands fidgeting as he held a piece of paper. When she opened the door, he hesitated for a moment, unsure of how to begin. He had come, he said, to thank her. At first, the woman was confused. She had no idea who he was or why he was there. But then he told her that he had been in the audience that night, the night of the performance, and that her music had changed his life. He explained that he had been at a crossroads, uncertain about what to do with his life, unsure of where to go next. But hearing her play, hearing the emotion and depth in every note had opened something in him. He said that it had reminded him of his own love for music, a passion he had buried for years. He hadn't picked up an instrument in so long, but after that night he knew he had to. The woman listened quietly, not knowing what to say. She had never expected her music to have that kind of impact. She had just been playing what she felt with no thought of what might come of it. But here was this young man, standing in front of her, sharing how her performance had ignited a spark in him. As he spoke, the woman began to realize something important. She had always believed that art, music in particular, was meant to be shared, even if only in the smallest, most intimate way. But what she hadn't fully understood was how powerful that sharing could be. She had created something in that moment, something that had transcended the performance. It wasn't just a song or a series of notes, it had become a catalyst for change. She thanked the young man for sharing his story, for showing her that her music had made a difference. And though she would never have sought out recognition or fame, this simple, genuine moment of connection was enough for her. It reminded her that art, when it comes from a place of sincerity, has the power to heal, to inspire, and to change lives. Over the months that followed, the woman continued to play. She didn't perform on grand stages or seek out attention. Instead, she continued to share her music in small, private moments, knowing that the true value of her art was in its ability to connect. The young man who had come to thank her went on to start his own journey with music. He began to write and compose, creating songs that reflected his own struggles, hopes, and dreams. He never forgot the woman who had played that night, whose music had helped him find his way. And as time went on, more and more people who had been in the audience found their own paths. Some took up their own instruments, others returned to old passions they had forgotten, while some simply found a renewed sense of joy in the everyday moments of life, all because of the simple, pure act of sharing something real and meaningful. The woman, though she never sought it, had left a legacy. It wasn't one of fame or glory. It was one of connection, of reminding people of the power of art to change lives. She had never known the impact she would have, but in the end, it didn't matter. What mattered was that she had given something that was true, something that came from the heart, and that in itself was enough.